Hello, happy Thursday. So we left off on chapter 5 and we learned about a rabbit named Edward, and he lives with Abilene, and her grandmother, Pellegrina, told a weird story that didn't impress Edward at all, that Abilene thought was a little weird because of the way it ended. And we left off with Edward staring up at the sky and repeating the phrase, "as bright as the stars on a moonless night." So chapter 5. Remember, they're going on a cruise. The house on Egypt Street became frantic with activity as the Tulane family prepared for their voyage to England. Edward possessed a small trunk, and Abilene packed it for him, filling it with his finest suits and several of his best hats and 3 pairs of shoes, all so that he might cut a fine figure in London. Before she placed each outfit in the trunk, she displayed it to him. "Do you like this shirt with this suit?" she asked him. "Or would you rather wear the black derby? You look handsome in it. Shall we pick it?" And then finally, on a bright Saturday morning in May, Edward, Abilene, and Mr. and Mrs. Tulane were all on board the ship, standing at the railing. Pellegrina was at the dock, and on her head she wore a floppy hat strung around with flowers. She stared straight at Edward, and her dark eyes glowed. "Goodbye," Abilene shouted to her grandmother. "I love you." The ship pulled away from the dock, and Pellegrina waved to Abilene. "Goodbye, lady," she called. "Goodbye." Edward felt something damp in his ears. Abilene's tears, he supposed. He wished that she would not hold him so tight. To be clutched so fiercely often resulted in wrinkling clothing. Finally, all the people on land, including Pellegrina, disappeared. Edward, for one, was relieved not to see her again. As was to be expected, Edward Tulane exacted much attention aboard the ship. "What a singular rabbit," said an elderly lady with 3 strings of pearls wrapped around her neck. She bent down to look more closely at Edward. "Thank you," said Abilene. Several little girls on board gave Edward deep glances full of longing. They asked Abilene if they might hold him. "No," said Abilene. "I'm afraid that's not the kind of rabbit who likes to be held by strangers." 2 young boys, brothers named Martin and Amos, took particular interest in Edward. "What does he do?" Martin asked Abilene on their second day at sea. He pointed at Edward, who was sitting on the deck chair with his long legs stretched in front of him. "He doesn't do anything," Abilene said. "Does he wind up somehow?" said Amos. "No, he does not wind up." "Then what's the point of him?" said Martin. "The point is, he's Edward," said Abilene. "That's not much of a point," said Amos. "It's not," said Martin, and then after a long thoughtful pause he said, "I wouldn't let anybody dress me like that." "Me either," said Amos. "Do his clothes come off?" asked Martin. "Of course they do," said Abilene. "He has many different outfits, and he has his own pajamas too. They're made of silk." Edward, as usual, was disregarding the conversation. A breeze was blowing off the sea, and the silk scarf wrapped around his neck billowed out behind him. On his head he wore a straw boater. The rabbit was thinking that he must look quite dashing. It came as a total surprise to him when he was grabbed off the deck chair, and first his scarf and then his jacket and pants were ripped from his body. He heard his pocket watch hit the deck on the ship, and then, held upside down, he watched the watch roll merrily along Abilene's feet. "Look at him, he's even got underwear," said Martin. He held Edward aloft so that Amos could see. "Take it off," shouted Amos. "No," screamed Abilene. Martin removed Edward's underwear. Edward was paying attention now. He was mortified. He was completely naked except for the hat on his head, and the other passengers on board of the ship were looking at him, directing curious and embarrassed glances his way. "Give him to me," screamed Abilene. "He's mine." "No," said Amos to Martin. "Give him to me." He clapped his hands together and then held them open. "Toss him." "Please," cried Abilene. "Don't throw him. He's made of china. He'll break." Martin threw Edward, and Edward sailed naked through the air. Only a moment ago, the rabbit had thought that being naked in front of the shipload of strangers was the worst thing that could have ever happened to him. But he was wrong. It was much worse being tossed in the air, naked, from the hands of a grubby, laughing boy to another. Amos caught Edward and held him up, displaying him triumphantly. "Throw him back," said Martin. Amos raised his arm, but just as he was getting ready to throw Edward, Abilene tackled him, shoving her head into his stomach and upsetting the boy's aim. So it was that Edward did not go flying back to the dirty hands of Martin. Instead, Edward Tulane went overboard. Chapter 6. How does a China rabbit die? Can a China rabbit drown? Is my hat still on my head? These were the questions that Edward asked himself as he went sailing out over the blue sea. The sun was high in the sky, and from what seemed to be a very long way away, Edward heard Abilene call his name. "Edward, come back!" she shouted. Come back? Of all the ridiculous things to shout, thought Edward. As he tumbled ears over tail through the air, he managed to catch one last glimpse of Abilene. She was standing on the dock of the ship, holding onto the railing with one hand, and in the other was a lump. No, it was a ball of fire. No, Edward realized. It was the gold pocket watch that Abilene had in her hand. She was holding it out high, reflecting the light on the sun. My pocket watch, he thought. I need that. And then Abilene disappeared from view, and the rabbit hit the water with such tremendous force, his hat blew off his head. That answers the questions, thought Edward, as he watched the hat dance away in the wind, and then he began to sink. He sank and sank and sank. He kept his eyes open the whole time, not because he was brave, but because he had no choice. His painted-on eyes witnessed the blue water turning to green and then to blue again. They watched as it finally became black as night. Edward went down and down. Here's a picture of him. So he got thrown. He flew way far from the ship. And in water, the further you get from the top, the darker it's going to be because the light's not going to reflect from the sun. He said to himself, if I'm going to drown, certainly I would have done it by now. Far above him, the ocean liner with Abilene aboard it sailed blissfully on, and the China rabbit landed finally on the ocean floor, face down. And there, with his head in the muck, he experienced his first genuine and true emotion. Edward Tulane was afraid. All right, one more chapter. Chapter 7. He told himself that certainly Abilene would come to find him. This, Edward thought, is much like waiting for Abilene to come home from school. I'll pretend that I'm in the dining room of the house on Egypt Street, waiting for the little hand to move to the 3 and the big hand to move to the 12. If only I had my watch, I would know for sure. But it didn't matter. She would be here soon, very soon, he thought. Hours passed, and then days, and weeks, and months, but Abilene did not come. Edward, for lack of anything better to do, began to think. He thought about the stars. He remembered that they looked like from his bedroom window. What made them shine so brightly, he wondered, for they were still shining somewhere even though he couldn't see them? Never in his life, he thought, have I been further away from the stars than I am now. He considered, too, the fate of the beautiful princess who had become a warthog. Why had she become a warthog? Because the ugly witch turned her into one. That was why. And then the rabbit thought about Pellegrina. He felt in some way that he could not explain to himself that she was responsible for what happened to him. It was almost as if she and not the boys who had thrown Edward overboard. And she was like the witch in the story. No, she was the witch in the story. True, she did not turn him into a warthog, but just the same, she was punishing him, although for what, he could not say. On the 297th day of Edward's ordeal, a storm came. The storm was so powerful that it lifted Edward off the ocean floor and led him in a crazy, wild, spinning dance. The water pummeled him and lifted him up and shoved him back down. Help, thought Edward. The storm, in its ferocity, finally flung him all the way out of sea, and the rabbit glimpsed for a moment of the light of an angry and bruised sky. The wind rushed through his ears. It sounded to him like Pellegrina laughing, but before he had time to appreciate being above water, he was tossed back down into the depths. Up and down, back and forth he went until the storm wore itself out, and Edward saw that he was beginning again a slow descent to the ocean floor. Oh, help, he thought. I can't go back down there. Help me. But still, down he went. Down, down, down. And then suddenly the great wide net of a fisherman reached out and grabbed the rabbit. The net lifted him higher and higher until there was almost an unbearable explosion of light, and Edward was back in the world, laying on the deck of a ship surrounded by fish. Hey, what's this? Said a voice. Ain't no fish, said another. That's for sure. The light was so brilliant that it was hard for Edward to see. But finally shapes appeared out of the light and the faces, and Edward realized that he was looking up at 2 men, one young and one old. Looks like some toy, said the grizzled old man. He bent down and picked Edward up and held him out by the paws. Considering him, "A rabbit, I reckon. It's got whiskers and rabbit ears, or the shape of rabbit ears at least." "Yeah, sure, a rabbit toy," said the younger man, and turned away. "I'll take it home to Nellie. Let her fix it up and set it to its rights. Give it to some child." The old man placed Edward carefully on the crate, positioning him so that he was sitting and could see out at the sea. Edward appreciated the courtesy of this small gesture, but he was heartily sick of the ocean and would have been satisfied never to set eyes on it again. "There you go," said the old man, and they made their way back to shore. Edward felt the sun in his face and the wind blowing through the little bit of fur left on his ears, and something filled his chest, a wonderful feeling. He was glad to be alive. "Look at that rabbit," the old man said. "Look how he's enjoying the ride. Looks like it, doesn't it?" "Aye, yep," said the young man. In fact, Edward Tulane was happy to be back among the living, that he did not even take umbrage as being referred as to an it. And that takes us to chapter 8, which we will read more tomorrow. Have a good day. Bye.